Amen. Well, in 2002, my wife and I were celebrating our 20th anniversary as pastors here at Cedar Park, and the board offered to send us to Hawaii for our 20th anniversary. And I said to them, why would I want to go to Hawaii? I would like to go to Turkey, however. And so they said, okay, we'll send you to Turkey. And so I went to Turkey along with my wife, she and I. I was going to just rent a car, and because I had the whole thing mapped out. I was going to hit all these biblical sites in Turkey. And when I called the company, they wisely said, well, I tell you what, why don't we'll give you the car, but we'll also provide a driver. And so it was actually through the tour company that I had previously used there. And so the son of one of their bus drivers was the driver in the vehicle that we had, this little van. And so he was a young guy, Benner Oker was his name. And he drove us around, and he said, I love this because he said, I'm getting a chance to see my own country. And so anyway, the three of us made our way around all around the western part of Turkey. We didn't go to eastern Turkey. It was a little too much conflict over there. But we did go to Syria and Turkey on that particular trip. My wife and I went to Syria just by ourselves. He left us off at the bus station. We got on a public bus and went to Syria and spent a week there. And that was before the war, and so there was actually buildings standing, and so it was great to see. But anyway, I had my tour all mapped out, and I wanted to go to the southern coast of Turkey, and because there's a lot of the biblical places around the coast there. And so that's what we did. And along the southern coast of Turkey, it's absolutely beautiful. And this is where the kind of country we were traveling through to get to Myra. And the reason I'm telling you about Myra is not just because it's a biblical place, but because it had a very famous pastor in that ancient church. Can anyone guess what that famous pastor's name was? His name was Nicholas. And so the actual historical figure that we know of as Saint Nicholas, that we celebrate at Christmas time, was actually the pastor of a church in Myra. And that's why, I wanted to go there because it was a biblical place. But it's a bit out of the way today. In the biblical time, it was easy to get to because it's a port city. There was a port right there, and then a little further inland was the town itself, and so it was easy to get there. It wasn't quite as easy for me to get there. It took a bit of driving over mountainous roads to get there. But Myra and Patara are located in the old province of Lycia in the Roman times. And there's some cool places to visit. This particular spot are the Lycian tombs that are carved into the rocky mountainside there. And this is right near Myra. There was a Roman theater. Every place the Romans were, they built theaters. They loved their theater. Guess they went to watch the movies or something, I'm not sure what. But anyway, you could generally tell how big the area was because a Roman theater was typically built to handle 1/10 the population in a region. And so you can tell by this theater, I don't know how many there's seats, but there was quite a few people there. And of course, it's a bit of a ruin today, but you can tell by some of these things in the foreground. This is my wife sitting on one of those pieces, but look at the sculpture there in the base of it, and it's quite beautiful. One of my other things that I wanted to visit in this general area, I also had a goal not only of visiting all the places of the Bible, but in ancient times, there were 33 temples to Artemis. And I wanted to visit as many of those as I could because if you've read my books, you know my book on Ephesus has a lot about Artemis in it. And so I went to see the various places. But there is nearby a place called Termisos. And it's high up in the hills. And that little standing arch that's actually been restood is from Termisos. And there were 2 temples to Artemis in that particular place. But there I am standing at the entry. And this picture is of my wife standing there. But like other places in Lycia, there are these magnificent rock-cut tombs. And basically, you know, this is not really, I mean, it is kind of a tourist site, but nobody goes there because it's, to most people, it's just a jumble. But to me, it's a fun place. But, I mean, you can see the remains of the Romans and the civilization that they had there. In this particular area, there were quite a few tombs. This is all around Termisos that had the Artemis temples. But I was only secondarily interested to find, and I've probably been to about 10 of the Artemis temples in the ancient world. But there were lots more to see. But anyway, where I was really headed, as I told you before, was to the town of Myra. And what I wanted to see there was this. This is the ancient church. And you can see it's in kind of tough shape, but they're working on getting it in visitable order. And so you can see they built a structure over it to keep it from deteriorating further. But you can see that there's some things there. This is the courtyard on one side of the church. And you go inside the church, and that's what it looks like today. All stone, of course, everywhere. Not terribly big, but, you know, beautiful. Like, look at the stone mosaic here at the entry. That's very nice. It's shot with a wide-angle lens, and so. But you can look around, and you can see, as this picture shows, you can see the in a Orthodox church of that era, you would have the saints. They would be just above you here, like, say, just above us like this. So all of the various saints, their frescoes would be there. And then higher up would be the angels. And then up in the ceiling, in the domes, would be Christ, Pantocreator, and like that. But they all were quite stylized. But here you can see, I think that's actually one of the angels there up a little higher. And it's deteriorated with time. But in the center of the dome and the ceiling would be Christ, Pantocreator, and the angels and luminaries around it. But, you know, you can see that in its day, the church had some beauty attached to it. And why not? It was the church, after all, of St. Nicholas, where he had pastored. And you can see some of the workmanship in the structure. The Greek language, of course, was what was spoken there. And so you can see, I don't read Greek, and so I don't know what that is. But I was also particularly interested in this sarcophagus. You can see the sarcophagus is broken. But that used to hold a tomb, or a body rather, and the body that was in this particular tomb was, in fact, the body of St. Nicholas. And so here I am standing at that particular spot. At a later time, in my notes, I have it. His body is not there anymore, obviously, but in the year 1087, his body was moved to Bari, Italy. I mean, you know, in that period of time, to have the physical remains of a saint was something. And of course, you didn't even need all of the saint. You could just bring a bone. I mean, I've seen in Istanbul, there is a place that supposedly has some bones from the hand of John the Baptist and skulls that belong to various ones. But any bone, because, you know, there was an attachment to the bones. in terms of sanctity. You remember that story about the bones of Elijah causing life to come? Well, really from that time, and Joseph, similarly. Remember when he said, when he left Egypt, when they said, when you leave Egypt, take my bones with you? And so they did. They took his bones from Egypt and brought them up, and they're buried in Shechem. There is the tomb of Joseph in Shechem, which they regularly riot over because the Jews go there to venerate the bones of Joseph, and the Muslims see them coming and they start rioting, and they've burned the building several times. And so, but anyway, that's the place of Joseph. But here it's the place of St. Nicholas, and I wanted to see it. And here, out in the courtyard, is a modern representation of it. Who would you guess that is a figure of? The statue there. You guessed it, that would be St. Nicholas, that statue with the children around him. Well, now let me, by the way, in the notes, what I gave you in the first section about Myra is really about St. Nicholas. And I used these notes in the bulk of them. I gave a chapel here once for the elementary kids. And so you can see that it's written in a relatively elementary style. And then I also used this for a Christmas Eve service one year. I forget what year it was, but I told this story as a Christmas Eve sermon one year here, 10 years ago or something like that. And so those notes capture that. St. Nicholas, in the form that we know him today, that is the guy in the red suit, is a very late developing tradition. Going back to St. Nicholas in 1823, the modern Santa, Clement Moore, wrote a piece called A Visit from St. Nicholas, and he was a chubby and plump, right, jolly old elf. Then 40 years later, a guy by the name of Thomas Nast drew a cartoon, and that's in the notes of the guy with the long pipe there. And then Abraham Lincoln, during the Civil War, asked him to prepare an illustration of Santa, St. Nicholas, with the Union troops. And according to the account of the Times, it was very demoralizing to the Confederate troops to realize that Santa Claus was hanging out with the Union troops and not with them. But Santa Claus, or St. Nicholas, Santa Claus really, was relatively obscure until about 1931. And starting that year, from 1931 to 1964, a man by the name of Haddon Sundblom drew a picture for like Harper's Magazine and National Geographic Magazine and Post. For the back cover on the Christmas issue, he would draw every year a new illustration of St. Nicholas. And in the notes, I have one of those. I forget, that one is from 1963. But every year on those magazine covers, back cover, there would be a new picture of St. Nicholas, and each year it got embellished, but always in the red suit with the white trimmings, and this was the style. And so really, Santa Claus, as we know him today, is a 20th century Coca-Cola invention, and so but the real St. Nicholas was a pastor in the town of Myra in the 3rd century. Now, and also, let me just show you this next picture here. This is the front of the church. So it would be the apse of the church, which would be this area up here. And but notice the shape of it. It's almost like it would be a place for the choir to sit. But in fact, the priest or the presbyter or whoever the leader would be, that would be the area where they would be. And I want you to notice this, because I'd like to relate a story of how I think this happened. I have not read this anywhere in history. I have only speculated upon it by going and looking at it and looking at one other thing. On this particular trip that I'm describing now in going to Turkey and Syria, I wanted to visit Nicaea. You know the Nicene Creed, for example, that describes the nature of Christ, his eternal nature. Well, that came out of the Council of Nicaea. And the Council of Nicaea took place in the year 325. There was a division in the country, in the Roman Empire, and it was among Christians. And because by this time, Constantine, the emperor, had become a Christian. The Edict of Toleration, which he didn't issue, but someone before him in 311. And so Christianity had been tolerated, but now it's become virtually the majority of the dominant religion of the Roman Empire. And a few years later, it would be the official religion of the Roman Empire. But in the year 325, there was a ruckus among Christians, particularly from a guy out of North Africa named Arius. And he was teaching something about Christ, and he was a very persuasive presbyter. And what he was teaching about Christ is that Christ really came from the Father and is therefore beneath the Father, but not the same as the Father. That there was been a doctrine that had been earlier that the Father and the Son were the same description. But that was not a true doctrine, nor was the doctrine that Christ had a point of creation. He was created as we are. And the Christian position is, the official position adopted by the Nicaeans, but held throughout Christianity, apart from Arius and a few of his people, was that Christ had always existed. He was equal with the Father. He was uncreated, so he's eternal, never was created, and of the same substance as the Father. But this was the debate they were having in Christianity. And Constantine didn't like the instability that created, because sometimes even when people argue over theology, even though they're both Christians, they kind of get to not liking each other. Can you believe that? I know it's hard to believe, but it actually used to happen. But anyway, Constantine didn't want that to divide the empire, and so he called a meeting in Nicaea. And he said, I want all of the bishops in the world who can get there to come to this meeting, and let's get this thing settled. And so 318 bishops showed up. Bishop, presbyter, pastor, those are the same terms. So a bishop was the head of a church in a region. And so, mostly there would be a single main church where the bishop was, even though there might be auxiliary churches here and there, what we would call in our setting branch churches. But there would be a bishop who was head over all of that. And those bishops were to get together, and 318 of them showed up. We know the names of some of them, but we don't know the names of all of them by a long shot. But we do know the number. And when the vote was taken, by the way, only Arius and a couple of his people voted for that view. Everybody else, to a person, voted in the terms to say what we believe is what we believe the Scripture says, and what we have been preaching all this time is that the Father and the Son are one. They are not one above the other, but they're one of the same substance. And that came out of the Nicene Convention. Well, Nicaea was a very important city. It was a seaport back then. Now it's filled in, so you have to drive there. You can't go by sea to Nicaea anymore. But back in that day, year 325, you could go by sea. Myra, on the southern coast of Turkey, was also a seaport. And as you could tell by the Roman theater and all of that, it was an important place. It was a stopping off point. It's right near Rhodes, by the way. If you're going to Rhodes, you could go across and probably, I don't know if a ferry goes across to Myra now, probably not, but there are ferries that go back and forth through those areas. But anyway, so in that day, Myra would have been an important city, and Nicholas would have been the bishop of that city. And so the chances, in my opinion, are very good that St. Nicholas went to the Council of Nicaea. Again, this part I'm speculating on because history doesn't give us the list. But that was his time, and he was the bishop of an important city. And when the emperor says, I want all the bishops of the important cities to come to a meeting, he would have gone. And it would have been a relatively easy trip to Nicaea. Probably would have taken him 3 or 4 days by sea to get there. So not a terribly arduous journey. So I'm sure that he went. Well, I'm a pastor, have been a pastor all my life. I know what pastors do. And I think I have an idea of how pastors think. So if I was a pastor and came into this building, I'd be looking around at the building. And in fact, I did build this building with the help of people who actually built it. But I helped to design it and construct it. But I built this building to be like other buildings that I have seen and know about. Someday I'd like to do a little 10-minute thing about how much this building looks like a particular building in Italy, the Capitol building, one of the Capitol buildings in Italy from about 500 years ago. But anyway, so when you go to a church as a pastor, you look around and you see how they've designed it and how they built it. And you do notice that these days churches tend to be built a lot alike. You know, you got the warehouse church, you know, so they're all this kind of boxes. That's a whole genre of building. And then you have other buildings that have a balcony, and the stairs always come down to the front, you know, empty out at the front as well as sometimes in the back. Well, I mean, pastors copy each other. It's what they do. And so now let me show you. Let's look at this picture here, because this is the church at Myra where Nicholas was the pastor. And this is the platform or the apse of the church in Nicaea where the Nicene Council was held. And what you notice, and where I'm sitting, is probably the place where Constantine sat as kind of chairman of the meeting. But you do notice that they are quite similar. And this is the building, by the way, at Nicaea as it exists today. And that's the inside. But you notice that's the apse at the far end there. And you notice that it's fairly narrow. It's probably, if you know the sanctuary of Cedar Park, it's probably as wide as the 2 center sections. So not huge. And today, it's just kind of a park inside of a city. I had to pay 1 million lira to be able to go inside this building when I was there. 1 million lira, Turkish lira. That was 1 year before they changed their currency values, and they took off 6 zeros off their currency. And so it would essentially be 1 lira. At the time, it would cost 1 million Turkish lira was about $1, 75 cents to $1. And so, you know, that's how much it cost me to get into this building. But the point that I'm making is that I think St. Nicholas was probably there at the Council of Nicaea, voting on the nature of Christ, that he was uncreated, even though he was born on Christmas. He was nonetheless the eternally existent God. And the guy who became known as St. Nicholas, I think would have been there and did, in fact, if he was there, did in fact vote for the idea that Jesus is uncreated as to his divinity. Fully God, fully man. As to man, born of the Virgin. As to God, uncreated and eternal in both directions. And I suspect, again, I admit that I'm speculating, but my evidence are the two buildings that are quite similar to each other, built about the same time that, that Nicholas was there, and he was paying attention to the building, and he went home and built only slightly smaller version of it as what had been at Nicaea. So there's Joe's take on history. Just to show you a couple of more pictures of, some of these are kind of the alleys going into where the burial place was. They didn't always bury them right in the church, sometimes in separate rooms. But here's just some of the artwork in stone that's from that place. And that's my wife who was with me on that trip. And this picture will mean nothing to anybody except me probably, but that little dark area there, this I took right outside the edge of the building. And that little dark area that looks almost like a trumpet, facing out, was actually the stem of a stemware. It's like a goblet with a long stem on it. That was the stem, and of Roman glass. Is green, the common color of Roman glass. And I saw it kind of buried in the mud there, and I just kind of worked it a little bit, and sure enough, it came out. And so I can say that I have a piece of glass, probably that St. Nicholas drank. That part I'm just baloney. But anyway, that's where I found it, and I dug it out and brought it home with me. Okay, so that's Myra. One of the churches associated with Christmas. Anybody want to ask a question about that or a comment on it before we go on to Bethlehem? Yes. Well, he is in that period of the Nicene Council. So 3rd century, late 3rd century, early 4th century. So Nicaea was 325. And so late 3rd century would be his time period, and into the 4th century, I do believe. Yes. Well, no, so the question was his church the only church in that region built that way? No, not really. I mean, the Nicene church was very much like a Roman pattern. That is a central nave with 2 wings. And in Roman buildings, assembly buildings, they were often like that. So just to go back to the Nicene build, let's see here. Well, this one you can kind of tell. There's the central nave, and then there's a wing on either side. The building of... let's see, go back to see that. Where is it? Yeah, here you can see that there is some similarity, but the similarity is not so much in the three wings, but in the way the apse is. And there are some other places where that has an apse like that, but it is distinct to these 2 places. I mean, I'm trying to think of where else I've seen it. Well, I'll tell you where I've seen it. In the new church in Ephesus. By new church, I mean after they moved where St. John is buried. If you go to St. John's burial place in Ephesus, in the new church, there's an apse like that. Only they're broader. Both of these are quite narrow. The others are more like a seating where you could, sit on it. So, and that church would be, I think that was built by Justinian, so that would be in the 500s. That one was built. And so after this time, there are numbers of churches that are built in that very common style. After, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so, I mean, clearly the church in Myra is built after the church in Nicaea, and it is, I do believe, similar. in many ways. Yeah. Anybody else? Okay, well, you'll never be quizzed on that, I'm sure. But you can ask somebody, what are the two biblical cities associated with Christmas? And they'll guess Nazareth and Bethlehem. And you say, no, it's actually Bethlehem and Myra. Myra is a biblical city. It's just not one you've ever heard of. Okay, so now let's go to Bethlehem. It is better known in this regard. When you go to Bethlehem, this is the church that you visit. This is kind of the square that you're seeing there, and then the church is the building behind there. It would be one of the oldest churches in the world, but certainly in Israel. When the Persians came in 613, they destroyed virtually every church. They did not destroy the church in Bethlehem. And the reason they didn't is when they walked into the church, it's got, I should have brought you pictures of this, there's beautiful mosaics, gold mosaics on the walls, which you can still see today. And they were of people wearing Persian clothes. And so why do you think there would be a church in Israel built, the 4th century, let's say, that has Persians on the wall? Why would that be? Exactly. The wise men were from Persia. And so they showed up in Persian dress. They appear at Bethlehem following the star. And so when the church was built later on, they put the wise men essentially on the walls of the church in these mosaics. And so here come the Persians in 613, bent on destroying everything. And they did destroy every church, in Israel, except the one in Bethlehem. And they said to themselves, these are our people on the wall here. We're not going to tear this place down. Let's keep it. And so, the Persians were only there a very short time, for less than 20 years, and then the Muslims came. The Persians then were Zoroastrian, and the Muslims came and ran the Persians out, and so and the long ordeal of the Holy Land under Muslim influence came about. But anyway, Bethlehem is a very, very old city. We first hear about it in Genesis 35, where it says Jacob set up a stone pillar at the place where God had talked with him, and he poured out a drink offering on it. He also poured oil on it. Jacob called the place where God had talked with him Bothell. Then they moved on from Bothell. While they were still some distance from Ephrath, Rachel began to give birth and had great difficulty. And as she was having great difficulty in childbirth, the midwife said to her, "Don't be afraid, for you have another son." As she breathed her last, for she was dying, she named her son Ben-Oni, but his father named him Benjamin. So Rachel died and was buried on the way to Ephrath, that is, Bethlehem. Over her tomb, Jacob set up a pillar, and to this day, that pillar marks Rachel's tomb. So Rachel is the only one of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and their 3 wives. Every one of them are all buried at the cave of Machpelah in Hebron. Rachel is the only one of the patriarch's wives who is not buried in Hebron, and she is buried there just outside of Bethlehem. And on the road from Jerusalem to Bethlehem, you go right by it. It says here a pillar was set up. That place still exists to this day. So, and you can go there and see it. So what was described in Genesis 35, you can go in 2020. Well, not 2020 because nobody can go now. But next year you can go, and you can go to Rachel's tomb in Bethlehem and see it there. And it's venerated by the Jews, and they take great pride in it. And then the story of Ruth in the Bible. It's also set in Bethlehem. as is the opening story of King David's life. So in 1 Samuel 16, the Lord said to Samuel, "How long will you mourn for Saul, since I have rejected him as king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and be on your way. I am sending you to Jesse of Bethlehem. I have chosen one of his sons to be king." So King David was from Bethlehem because his father was from Bethlehem. So that's where David lived. David was a guy from Bethlehem. Why do you think Joseph and Mary, even though they lived in Nazareth 70 miles to the north, and they had to go all the way down to Bethlehem, why did they have to do that? Because the government wanted to have a census. And instead of coming to you, like they did to me this year, or actually they sent it to me in the mail, and I responded to it. Although someone came to my house to tell me they were going to send something in the mail. Okay, well, thanks for coming to my house to tell me you're going to send me something in the mail. Crazy. But anyway, and that day they wanted a census, but they wanted to know who they had so they could tax them. Not much has changed, has it? You know, but why did Mary and Joseph, and 9 months pregnant, you don't go on a 70-mile journey riding a donkey unless you want to make sure you have a baby right away, I guess. Never had one. But because Mary and Joseph were of the lineage of David. And that was David's hometown, and they were descendants of David. So everybody basically had to go back to their family hometown to be counted. And so Mary and Joseph had to make the journey to show up, to be counted, so they could be taxed. And that's the way it was. So anyway, it has association with David. And then one of the most compelling stories in the Bible is David is hiding out from Saul, and they're down in out in the desert down by En-Gedi. And David is sitting there, and En-Gedi, you that have been there, is down by the Dead Sea, and it's hot down there. And the water, I've been in the water. It's not cold, and especially if it's summertime, there's very little water, and it's not going to be cold water. And anyway, and David is down there hiding in that desert, and he says, "Man, what I wouldn't give to just get a drink out of the well at Bethlehem." Well, Bethlehem at the time was in Philistine control, but 3 of his guys said, our leader wants a drink from the well in Bethlehem. Let's go get it for him. And so they went to Bethlehem under cover of darkness, under threat of their own lives, dropped the pot down into the well, pulled it up and poured it into their water vessels. And it was probably, Bethlehem is probably 25 miles of tough climbing to get across the desert to get to Bethlehem from En-Gedi. And so they bring it back, they give it to David and said, "We heard you say you wanted some water from the well of Bethlehem. Here it is." And he looks at it and he says, "Are you kidding me? You guys risked your lives to bring me water from the well in Bethlehem?" And he says, "And you expect me to drink this? This is sacred. This represents the blood of 3 men." And so he poured it out on the ground as an offering to God, because it was so valuable, having been purchased under the threat of 3 great warriors' lives. I mean, it's an amazing story all the way around. David, his men, everything about it is amazing. Well, these are some of the names and people associated with Bethlehem. But probably the most important Old Testament description comes out of Micah, where it says, "But you, Bethlehem, Ephrathah, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel, whose origins are from of old, from ancient times." Well, Micah is not talking about David here, because David has been dead for, 250 years when Micah writes this prophecy. But he's clearly prophesying about Jesus, the one who had come from the house of David. And so he said, there's going to be a ruler who will rule over Israel and who is from ancient times. In other words, even though he's going to rule in the future, his origins go back to ancient times. And so he's talking about Jesus. And that's when we come to the New Testament and the birth of Jesus. Matthew chapter 2. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east, Persia, came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who's been born, King of the Jews? We saw his star in the east and have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. When he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Christ was to be born. "In Bethlehem in Judea," they replied, "for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you will come a ruler who will be shepherd of my people Israel." Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and make a careful search for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me so that I too may go and worship him." Well, when these wise men, and by the way, you know they're not going to be celebrating Christmas in Olympia this year. Not because of anti-religion, because they couldn't find 3 wise men down there. But anyway, it's an old joke, but it's more appropriate every day, isn't it? Okay. Well, so these wise men from Persia arrive looking for the king. They've seen his star in the east. And of course, everybody is abuzz about this. Not just that he was to be born, that this was the king of the Jews that was to be born, but because a star had revealed this. Now, they would have gotten this somewhere out of the Jewish scriptures. And the Old Testament, and particularly the book of Daniel, for example, was popular in Persia at this time. Why would the book of Daniel be popular in Persia in the first century? Yes. Exactly. The answer is because that's where Daniel was. And so once again, it's a Persian, and to their line of thinking, he's ruler in Persia, Daniel. And so he was well known. So somehow, or from reading the scriptures, the prophecies, these wise men, Magi, were able to make a discernment that something was happening there. But it was the fact that it was the king of the Jews. But more than that is that a star had revealed this or shown this to be the case. And, I don't in this, I don't think I included it here. I should. I have it in the notes, and they're not very big there, but there's various coins which you will see there. But many of the people who were leaders in that part of the world in that period of time went out of their way to put a star on their coins. So on one side typically is the leader's face, and on the back side many of them have a star. And the first coin that I show there is a Hasmonean coin. That would be a Jewish coin from the first century before Christ. The Hasmoneans were a local Jewish group that kind of tried to overthrow the Greeks and had a little rule there for a while. But the anchor is one, but on the backside, that's a star. It's kind of a star burst. Well, that's very common among Hasmonean coins. This is the coin we know of as the widow's mite. For example, that's the same. It's a lepton, but it's a widow's mite. But I show other coins there. That particular one is from Alexander Jannaeus. But then there's a Byzantine coin from the 1st century BC. It's in the margin there. On the left-hand side, that's Artemis. And then on the back side of her coin is the crescent moon and the star. And the crescent moon and the star was a symbol of Byzantium. It came about because Artemis was the patron goddess of the moon and of the city of Byzantium. And when they were under attack at one point in time, miners were trying to mine underneath the city wall. And the moon revealed the activity in the ground, even though it was at night. And so they attributed that to Artemis, the goddess of the moon, who revealed this. So Artemis's coins often have a moon on them. And sometimes it'll be on the front, so her bust will be on one side, and then she kind of rides the moon. That's a common, I have several of those. But then these others that you see are various Roman emperors that would have the star and the moon as part of their coins. And I probably have 15 examples of that from antiquity. I've kind of made it a point of, when I've been able to find one, I'll buy it. eBay is a great place. But anyway, but it illustrates the point that in this period of time, there was a widespread belief that the stars would shine in a particular way upon those who are destined for greatness. And so if you were a Roman emperor, you said, well, voila, here I am, and there's the star on my coin that shows that, I have been favored by heaven to be the emperor or to be the Caesar or whatever. But it's a very common thing. And so when these wise men show up from Persia to say, where's the one, where is this auspicious king who is to be born or has been born? We want to know who this auspicious and great King of the Jews is. And we know that he's great because we have seen his star in the east and it has led us here. I mean, that's powerful. And people would have understood it, that this clearly is a great king because the very stars of heaven are announcing his birth. And so they would have regarded that. And so when it says the whole city was abuzz, very much so. And of course, the fact that King Herod was all amped up about this, he was notoriously jealous. You talk about Kim Jong-il, he kills his half-brother and anybody else that he was worried about that might try to take over his throne. Well, that was King Herod. He killed he killed his wife. He killed his sons. Because if he thought, okay, they're plotting to take over. And so I'm just going to, you might be my son, but you're dead because I don't like the way you're looking at me lately. And, or his wife, And he was a serious guy in terms of anxiety. And he killed a lot of people. And he was brutal. But you know what his title was given to him by the Caesars? King of the Jews. That was King Herod, the king of the Jews. And so these guys show up from the east and say, hey, there's a king of the Jews has been born. King Herod would have said, I'm the king of the Jews, and I'm not just born. But he didn't. He was a savvy politician. He says, oh, that's wonderful. I'm so interested in what you have to say. And you're here to worship him? I want to do that too. Why don't you go find out where he is and let me know, and I'll come join you, and we'll all worship together. First I'll kill him, then I'll kill you. A lot of people don't know there was 4 wise men. They brought gold, frankincense, and myrrh. The 4th guy brought fruitcake, and he was kicked out immediately. And so we only think of them as being 3. Actually, does the Bible say how many wise men there were? It does not. It doesn't tell us how many there were, so there might have been 4. And it would have mentioned fruitcake, I'm sure, if that had been one of the things. Do you know what frankincense is? Well, let me say it like this. Frankincense is incense. Do you know what myrrh is? It's also incense. Do you know what gold is? Yes, you know what gold is. But incense was valuable, and myrrh was used in burial. But the rising of a king was to be, incense would be burned, and so they were really bringing offerings suitable for a king. And gold is always welcome in the royal house, in most anybody's house, if somebody's given it to you. So it created quite a stir, and Herod wants to put an end to this. Now, Herod was paranoid, but God fires a shot across the bow of King Herod's ship in a big way, by first of all announcing that it's the King of the Jews that's being born, and the other King of the Jews is sitting right there. But the fact that Jesus would be born in Bethlehem is significant. And let me come back to that, but let me just show you a couple more pictures here so I don't end up just talking and not showing pictures. There's the entrance to the church in Bethlehem, as it is now. You can see in times past, it was a more grand entrance, but this particular entrance, you have to actually, you can't walk in standing up. You have to literally bow down, and that was by design. And this picture shows people from our group lined up there, and there's Ruth and Luke Lewis sitting out there. But you see, Luke is sitting down there, and his head would barely, fit through the hole there. And in part, it was so they would bow down, but also people were riding their horses into church. And so they didn't want people riding their horses in. And so, we'll solve that problem. You don't put a sign on the door that, no horse, no service, or have horse, no service. No, they just, put it down there low, and that's how it is. Inside, that's the door from the inside, and you can see what the church looks like. I love this lady that's standing there kind of guarding things. She looks like a happy camper, doesn't she? But that she would be probably Armenian or Orthodox. Multiple groups share the area. And when you go into Bethlehem, right here, our group is one of our groups that I've taken. They've actually, the floor that we're looking at, kind of that darker area down in the front, that's actually about this much below the rest of the floor, and it has boards that go over it, hinged boards, so that people don't fall into it. But when you look down below, what you see are the mosaics from the original church, the Byzantine mosaics that are there. And by the way, these on the front of this building, those are Byzantine mosaics that I had copied from the church in Jerusalem at Dominus Flevit. And in both of these side rooms, I think you can actually get into that one. There's a mosaic in there that is a Byzantine mosaic, and they're all smaller stones. It's called Jesus blessing the wedding and turning the water into wine. But the pots, I had the artist copy those pots from a chapel out of Istanbul called Kora, and where the royalty used to go for services. And then the water pot that Jesus is pouring out, or that's being poured out, those are actual Byzantine mosaics that I have picked up on my travels. And so I asked the artist to include those in the creation of that particular mosaic back there, which she did. But those kinds of mosaics, that's what you would be looking at on the floor there. Very often when you're going to Bethlehem, these are, I can't tell the difference between Armenian or Orthodox, but one of the two, they're conducting a service there. And, in those traditions, to do a service, you don't need an audience. All you need are the celebrants. And so they offer the incense and the prayers and the readings and all of that. And, they can go on for 45 minutes, and it's just them. And that would be a very common style for many of these holy places. But then that's in the church in Bethlehem. Multiple churches share the same facility. This is one of the columns that I took, but those little holes, you can see that it's the cross. Each of the little holes in it are the places where the wounds of Christ. And so when you come in and you need healing, you would just stick your fingers in those holes and essentially, touch the wounds of Christ. For by his stripes we're healed. And, putting your faith in Christ, that one is there. There's another one in the church in Hagia Sophia up where the empress would sit, and where they've actually worn all the way through the stone. It's been touched so many times that it's literally, human hands have worn away the marble of that particular, it's a marble that would be that thick. They've literally worn holes in it with the touching of it. But anyway, when you go into the church, you go down, and beneath the apse, there is this cave. And in the cave, it's all, of course, overlaid with these drapes. And the silver star marks the place, by tradition, where Christ was born. And so, and it's just a small little area. Here we're down there. You can see everybody's got to take their picture. And so I went all the way to the back of the cave, essentially, to take this picture, and the place where the actual birthplace is up in the front there. And of course, this is one of my favorite pictures. And so there's just so much happening in this picture. And I see David and Dale Matherly, they're there, and my daughter Roz on the left, and her son Grant. And there's just a bunch of people in these pictures that some of you might recognize. But anyway, and Carrie, she's a great photographer, and she's got her picture there along with Mike. But anyway, that's down in the cave. And, last time I was there, we had to wait like an hour and a half standing in, in this huge line. And it was kind of comical because you got people trying to crowd, and one thing about Americans, they don't like people crowding in line. They don't like it on the highway. They don't like it any place. And so when one lady and I got in the back, and we kind of spread out like this to keep people from shoving in past us, and yeah, we were spiritual. There's no doubt about that. But anyway, so when you come out of the church, there's a square there. Right across the square is this mosque. And any place where there's a significant church in because, Bethlehem 100 years ago was virtually 100% Christian town and had been for 2,000 years. Today, there's only a handful of Christians left. They've left. And the ones that are there get persecuted, not good. And so what you'll find are these mosques like this. They'll build the tower, and they'll point the speakers down into the church. And 5 times a day, they'll blast the church with the Muslim call to prayer. And basically, they're saying, we're better than you are. And so anyway. And also on the square is a nice restaurant that I like to eat at. It's St. George's Restaurant. I could tell you some funny stories about that, but I'm not going to. There's some various caves and things associated with it. One of the great names of church history is St. Jerome, and he translated the Vulgate translation of the Bible and said to have done it here. This is kind of one of the courtyards in kind of the Catholic section of the church, and some cool things there. But outside of Bethlehem, there is the Herodium. And I can't believe I got such poor pictures here today, but I was trying to meld different ones together, and I see that I've left out the pictures that I wanted. But you see that kind of flat top mountain in the background? That is the highest spot in all of the Judean mountains. And that is actually partially an artificial hill. It's called the Herodium. And the Herodium was a fortress built by King Herod. If you're standing on the Mount of Olives and you look south, you can see the Herodium from the Mount of Olives. You know, it's probably 5 miles away, but it's there. And Bethlehem from Jerusalem is maybe 7 miles in the olden days, but in truth today, it's like, what's the difference between Juanita and Bothell? None. You know, it all just, and Kirkland, it all just runs together. And that's the way Bethlehem and Jerusalem are today. They just run together, except for the wall that's around the West Bank. But the Herodium was where Herod was buried. They found his tomb not so long ago. It had been robbed because they made the mistake of publishing. You know, he had gold overlays with jewels on his tomb. And you know, when you announce that, and in 2,000 years, there's somebody that said, you know what, I'm going to find that sucker. I'm going to dig that guy up, and I'm going to steal that thing. I knew a guy that was buried in a $175,000 gold overlaid casket. He had lots and lots of money. I mean, but Herod went 10 times better than that. And that guy was another part of the country, not from around here. But Herod, I mean, it's gold, and it's got jewels and everything. But he was buried there in Herodium, and for the longest time they couldn't figure out, they tried finding it, and when they did find it, they realized somebody else had found it before them. But anyway, and the remains are in the Israeli museum. But Herodium was a fortress. Now, I told you that Herod was paranoid, okay? Let me describe his escape plan. He was from Moab, which would be southern Jordan. That was his home territory. And he set up things so that if anybody came after him, he could escape. Now, he built his fortress there on that hill because he had defeated the Parthians in a great battle a few decades earlier on that hill. But he builds this fortress. So he builds up a mountain, essentially, and then he goes up from the top of the mountain. He goes up another 60 feet in a stone fortress, and that was a few miles from Jerusalem. So if push came to shove and somebody was after him, he would get some soldiers and he would make a mad dash from Jerusalem down to Herodium. And then, depending on how things were, he could make a mad dash from there down to Masada, because that was his next fortress. And it was maybe 20 miles away across the desert, across the wilderness. And then from there, he could cross over beyond the Dead Sea, and he had another fortress over there. And this line of fortresses was basically his escape plan. Well, so this Herodium is like a symbol of power. It's the highest point in all the Judean hills. And on top of it is a huge tower. And by the way, from there, you can see the Dead Sea. And probably could see the Mediterranean as well. I mean, it's too hazy these days, but I would guess that back in the day, you could see the Mediterranean from up on top there. That's how high it was. It's the citadel of his power, of the King of the Jews. Okay, where was Jesus born? Jesus was born within sight of the Herodium. So the poor people lived down in Bethlehem, and the powerful people, and Herod with his people, they were at Herodium. So the powerful king of the Jews is in Herodium. The true king of the Jews is in a manger down in Bethlehem, maybe a couple of miles away. And it's very likely that a bit later, when the soldiers came, you know, the slaughter of the innocents, when Herod said, kill all the baby boys 2 years and under, they probably came from Herodium. those soldiers probably marched out of Herodium a couple of miles over to Bethlehem and killed all the boys in that area. And that's why I say the birth of Jesus, the King of the Jews, was a shot across the bow of King Herod. Because Jesus, the King of the Jews, was born essentially in the shadow of the Herodium, where Herod had his greatest power. And you know, if you've been hearing my preaching lately, I've given a lot of emphasis to the kingdom, the idea of the kingdom. So here is Jesus, the king of his kingdom, basically just poking it in the eye of the pretender, Herod, who thought he was the great power and the great king. Let me tell you something. God is not going to put up with contenders to the throne. He didn't then, and he won't now. You know, he is king, he's in charge, and he doesn't appreciate those who want to replace him. And God help the person who wants to be king of their own life, because they need God's help. And God help the country that thinks they're going to go without God, because God will not favor that. He'll not put up with that. You know, when we as a country say, "In God we trust," and mean it, God honors that. When we say we trust in our own cleverness and ability and in our army and in our scientists and in our banks and all of that, no, that's not how it works. You know, and God will not accept it. And so I think, you know, Bethlehem, in a way, its situation, not only as the house of David, prophetically fulfilling that, but also as a contrary move to King Herod, the other king of the Jews. It's just classic. It's just perfect. It's just perfect. The meek and mild child in the manger is more powerful than the man who has the great fortress 2 miles away with a string of fortresses and a big army there to defend himself. You know, don't be fooled because he was a baby. Because Jesus started out as a baby, but he doesn't end up as a baby. He ends up as King of Kings and Lord of Lords, and his kingdom will fill the earth. And that day is coming, I think, sooner rather than later. But anyway, the two cities. What are the two cities of Christmas? Bethlehem and Myra. Yeah, you got a good memory. You could last at least an hour. That's very good. Okay, anybody with a comment or question before we pray? Okay, let's pray together. Why don't you stand with me, you that are here, and thank you that are joined us online. Appreciate you being with us. Let me, I can't respond. I'm not really set up to respond to the people online tonight, so we'll do that another time. By the way, next Wednesday night, we're going to do the Christmas Eve services, the start of them, because, you know, we got to be able to have enough room to space everybody out. So we'll do next Wednesday night. Next Thursday night will be Christmas Eve services, both nights here. So we won't be in here. It'll only be in the sanctuary. And then someone told me that there's not going to be Wednesday night services on the last week in December as well. And so we won't do it. So Chris won't be back then either. So anyway, wouldn't want you to come but confirm all of that, because what does Joe know? Not much. Okay, let's pray. Father God, we thank you for the tremendous unity of the Word, that the Old Testament prophesied what the New Testament showed. And we can see, looking back, how your word is coming true more and more with each passing day. We know that the day of the coming of the Lord, not as a baby, but as King of Kings and Lord of Lords, is soon at hand. Help us, Lord, to be ready. Cleanse us of our sins and failures. Strengthen us with your Holy Spirit to do your work, to share the good news of the gospel. And now, Lord, as we go our separate ways, I pray that the peace of God that passes all understanding will rest and abide with us all, both now and forevermore. Amen.